The night of April 14, 1871, was quiet in a remote part of rural Tennessee when 27 men on horseback surrounded a small wooden cabin. The old court records only say that an incident occurred, and then the entire file mysteriously vanished. What makes this night different from dozens of other attacks during Reconstruction is the man trapped inside the cabin. He wasn't an ordinary farmer or traveler. He was a man with a terrifying wartime record. During the Civil War, he had killed 247 Confederate soldiers, all from distances of over 800 yards. For decades, historians tried to confirm the numbers, but most of his unit's files were destroyed in a government fire in 1873. Only 7 letters, discovered many years later in 1954, confirmed the same chilling detail. He never missed. On that spring night, those writers had no idea the kind of man they were approaching. Before understanding the siege of 1871, we must go back 6 years earlier to the final days of the Civil War. In 1865, the Cumberland Plateau region, stretching between Tennessee and Kentucky, was a place full of tension. The North had won the war, but in these isolated valleys, the conflict never truly ended. Families were divided, some having fought for the Union and others for the Confederacy, and the anger of those choices still lived in every church, farm, and back road. Into this troubled world walked Nathaniel Harden, returning home in late November 1865. He was 31, born free in Pennsylvania. His mother had once escaped slavery, and his father worked in the iron factories. Nathaniel had learned to shoot when he was only 7, using a rifle so powerful it bruised his shoulder every time he practiced. By age 15, he could hit a small playing card from 200 paces. War sharpened his skill even further. He first enlisted in the 54th Pennsylvania Infantry, but officers quickly noticed his talent. After hitting a Confederate officer from an unbelievable distance, he was moved into a special sharpshooter detachment, an unofficial unit whose soldiers fought alone or in pairs and specialized in long-range precision shooting. After the war, with only the money he had left, Harden bought 47 acres of rough land deep in a hidden hollow. The place was difficult to reach, with thick forests and a muddy wagon track leading in. It wasn't valuable land, which is exactly why he could afford it. He built a small cabin by hand and lived quietly, visiting the nearby town of Elkton only when he needed supplies. People in the town noticed him. After all, a black man owning land was rare at the time, but he was always polite and kept to himself. Still, the silence that followed him whenever he entered a room made it clear he was not welcome. By spring 1866, Harden had cleared fields, planted corn, and begun raising chickens, but his presence stirred resentment. A former Confederate lieutenant named Josiah Ketchum had returned to town around the same time. Bitter and angry after losing his arm and home in the war, Ketchum spent his nights drinking with other defeated soldiers. One evening, someone mentioned Harden, the black man living alone in the hollow. When the men learned he had been a Union sharpshooter, the mood in the room changed immediately. They knew exactly what sharpshooters did during the war, and some realized Harden might be personally responsible for killing men they once fought beside. The first confrontation came quietly in April 1866. Harden had gone to town for supplies when Ketchum and 2 others stopped him outside the store. They questioned him, hinted at threats, and mocked him for fighting their boys. Harden, trained to stay calm in dangerous situations, simply said the war was over. But the men made it clear they did not agree. When Harden walked away, he could feel their hatred burning into his back. The harassment grew quickly. 2 weeks later, someone shot his dog. Soon after, men ripped up his cornfield. They burned his scarecrow and watched the smoke rise like a warning. Harden said nothing, but he began sleeping with his rifle next to him. He had survived years of war, but now he faced a new kind of battle, one fought in silence, darkness, and hatred. The harassment against Nathaniel Harden did not stop. In fact, It grew darker, more organized, and more dangerous. What began as ugly stares and heated words soon turned into a campaign meant to break him, to chase him off the land he had built with his own hands. The men behind these attacks were not random troublemakers. They were former Confederate soldiers who had lost the war but refused to accept defeat. For them, Reconstruction felt like humiliation, and seeing a black man owning land, farming it, and walking through town with confidence was something they could not tolerate. By early May 1866, Harden's peaceful life had fully transformed into a battle for survival. After the killing of his dog and the destruction of his crops, he rebuilt what he could, replanting under the moonlight. This time, he set up a scarecrow wearing an old Union jacket, a quiet symbol that he had served, that he had earned his place. But the message only enraged his enemies further. The next morning, he found the scarecrow burned to the ground, its frame standing like a warning cross in his field. One evening, as darkness filled the hollow, Harden sat quietly on his porch cleaning his long, range-sharps rifle, the same weapon he had relied on throughout the war. He knew the sound of the woods intimately, the way branches swayed, the rhythm of the creek, the hoots of owls. So when he heard the faint but unmistakable sound of horses approaching, he knew they were not riders passing casually along the trail. They were moving with a purpose, slow, careful, and trying not to be heard. Then they appeared, 27 horsemen, most of them wearing rough, white hoods with eye holes crudely cut out. The torches they carried flickered wildly, throwing strange shadows across the clearing. Even though their faces were covered, Harden recognized their horses, their saddles, their posture. He saw Ketchum, the ex-lieutenant with one arm. He saw the Tyree brothers, men who had served in the Confederate infantry. He saw others he had spotted around Elkton, whispering behind store counters or glaring from across the road. They formed a wide circle around his cabin, staying far enough to avoid a shotgun blast, but close enough to block any escape. Ketchum's voice echoed across the clearing as he announced that Harden had been warned and had ignored those warnings. According to them, the valley didn't belong to his kind. It didn't matter that Harden had bought the land legally. It didn't matter that he kept to himself and harmed no one. Their hatred didn't need logic. It only needed a target. Harden didn't shout, didn't beg, didn't panic. Instead, he calmly studied the wind, the distance, and the firelight the same way he had done on battlefields years before. He stepped forward and spoke with a steady voice, saying he counted exactly 27 of them, and wondered aloud how many planned to survive the night. His words fell across the clearing like a cold blade. Some of the men shifted nervously in their saddles. Harden explained the simple math of war. He could drop 8 of them before the rest scattered, maybe 10 if they bunched together in fear. Every word he spoke carried truth, and they knew it. These men had fought in the war. They had seen what sharpshooters could do. They had seen bodies drop in impossible ways, killed by someone they never saw. One rider backed up, another hesitated. Someone whispered that he was bluffing, but the confidence wasn't there. Harden continued speaking in a calm, controlled voice. He told them he would start with the leaders, Ketchum first, then the Tyrees. He listed them by name, and the fact that he knew exactly who they were, even behind masks, shook them. More riders began pulling away. In the end, the men retreated into the darkness. The torches bobbed away through the trees until the hollow was quiet again, but the danger wasn't gone. The retreat wasn't defeat. It was only delay. Harden stayed awake for 3 nights straight, expecting them to return. He knew how men driven by pride and bitterness behaved. They weren't finished. They would come back stronger, angrier, and more prepared, and he was right. The years that followed turned the region increasingly hostile. Reconstruction brought new rights for Black Americans: voting, land ownership, education. But these rights angered white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who believed violence was the only way to maintain control. Harden's presence became a symbol that challenged their worldview. Not only was he a black landowner, he was a veteran with a deadly skill set, a man who refused to bow or flee. By 1867, Harden's farm had grown. He built a barn, expanded his fields, and even raised hogs. Other freed families began settling near the area, some of them visiting Harden for guidance or encouragement. To many in the black community, he was an example of what freedom could look like. But to the men who hated him, this was the last straw. Things escalated further in 1868 when Harden registered to vote. His ballot, like thousands of others across Tennessee, helped elect politicians who supported equal rights. The reaction was immediate. Violence became systematic. Night riders burned schools, threatened voters, and attacked black families across the region. Harden's Hollow was visited 3 more times in 1869. Each time he stood in his doorway, rifle ready, explaining the same mathematics of survival. Each time the riders decided retreat was safer, but they were learning. Their failures only made them more determined. Harden sensed the shift. The attacks were becoming more coordinated, more strategic, more dangerous. The stage was being set for the deadly confrontation of 1871, a night that would change everything. By the year 1870, Harden's life in the Tennessee Hollow seemed to stand on a thin edge. For 4 years, he had endured threats, property damage, and repeated nighttime visits from men determined to push him off his land. But despite everything, he stayed. He expanded his small farm, built a strong barn, and improved his cabin. He welcomed new families who arrived looking for a fresh start. To many black settlers, Harden became a symbol of courage, proof that a man who stood his ground could survive even in a hostile region. One of the biggest changes in Harden's life came in early 1870 when he met a young woman named Ruth Ann Kincaid. She was 24, smart, educated, and determined. She had left Mississippi with relatives, fleeing a place where violence against black families had become unbearable. Ruth Ann and Harden shared something deeper than just hope. They both understood fear, and they both believed in building a future despite it. They married quietly in a church 12 miles away, with only a handful of supporters present. Harden expanded his cabin into a 4-room home, adding windows with real glass panes. For the first time since the war, he felt like life might finally move forward. Ruth Ann soon began teaching children from nearby black families. She set up a small classroom attached to their cabin. At first, she taught 6 students, then 9, then 14. Her school became a symbol, not only of education, but of possibility, and symbols, especially in this era, made enemies. To the white supremacists in the region, education for black children was not just offensive, it was threatening. Every new student represented a future voter, a future landowner, a future citizen. And Harden's home, with its schoolroom and growing fields, represented something they couldn't accept: progress. In March 1871, their anger became personal and violent. 3 of Ruth Ann's students were attacked on their walk home. They were just children, ages 9 to 12, but that didn't stop the attackers from beating them so badly that one boy lost sight in one eye. When Harden and Ruth Ann heard the news, they were devastated. Harden reported it, but the local marshal claimed there were no witnesses, which was the same excuse he always used when black families were harmed. Ruth Ann began urging Harden to leave Tennessee. She had always been braver than she looked, but even bravery has limits. One night, she told him that staying meant risking their lives. Harden understood her fear, but he also understood something else. If they left without resisting, it would send a message that violence always wins. He didn't want to flee the place he had bought with honest work, the place he had defended more than once, the land he considered home, but the deciding moment came quickly. On April 12, 1871, while Harden was away checking traps, someone burned the schoolroom, the classroom Ruth Ann had worked so hard to build. They used coal oil to make sure the fire didn't spread to the main cabin. It wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to send a message: leave or next time you won't be so lucky. Ruth Ann stood in front of the ashes the next morning with tears in her eyes. The charred books, ruined slates, and broken chalkboards felt like an attack not just on her, but on every child who ever walked into that room with hope. She told Harden plainly, "We are leaving," and this time Harden did not argue. But he added one line, "Before we go, I'm going to teach them one last lesson." The calmness in his voice wasn't anger, it was resolve. Ruth Ann left to stay with a family across the ridge, safe from what was coming. Harden told her he needed time to pack, but instead he spent 2 full days preparing for war. He knew they would return, likely in larger numbers and with better planning. So he transformed his cabin into a defensive position, cutting narrow firing slits into the walls, preparing water barrels to fight fire, stacking ammunition around the room, and measuring distances from every entry point. He planned not just to survive, but to control the fight. And most importantly, he began writing letters. He wrote 7 in total, each one detailed, exact, and powerful. He recorded every attack, every name he recognized, every threat made over the last 5 years. These letters were addressed to Union officials, federal marshals, politicians, and a newspaper editor in Philadelphia. After writing them, Harden sealed the letters in a metal box and buried it near the creek. On the inside wall of the cabin, he left instructions for Ruth Ann on how to recover them if he did not survive. By the time Harden finished, the stage was set. The attackers believed they were preparing a simple act of violence. But Harden was preparing something much bigger, a battle that would be remembered long after the smoke cleared. The night of April 14, 1871, approached quietly, but the quiet only made the danger louder. The night of April 14, 1871, was dark, moonless, and cold, far colder than a typical Tennessee spring. Nathaniel Harden sat inside his cabin with his rifle across his lap, listening carefully to every sound outside. He had spent 2 days preparing for this moment, and he knew without doubt that the men who had burned the schoolroom would be back. The real question was not if they would come, but how they would come. And when they finally arrived, Harden realized immediately that this attack was very different from the chaotic rides of the past. The riders didn't approach with shouting or torches this time. There were no dramatic threats or loud warnings. Instead, they came with strategy, silence, and precision, like soldiers on a mission. Harden recognized the difference instantly. He had spent years reading enemy movements during the war, and this time the movements were careful and coordinated. These were not drunken men riding in anger. These were men following a plan. He heard the horses first, far away, then closer, then stopping. The men dismounted deliberately about a quarter mile from the cabin. Harden pictured them tying their horses to trees so the animals wouldn't bolt at the sound of gunfire. He imagined the men gathering quietly, checking their weapons, dividing into groups. The new leader was not Ketchum this time. Harden knew Ketchum lacked the strategic mind for such a mission. This attack was organized by someone else, Robert Calhoun, a former Confederate major known for being methodical, disciplined, and merciless in battle. Calhoun had been planning this assault for weeks. His goal was simple: surround the cabin completely, blind Harden with sudden torchlight, then rush from all sides before Harden could take accurate shots. If Harden came out shooting, they would concentrate fire on the doorway. If he stayed inside, they would burn him out. Either way, Calhoun believed Harden would be dead before sunrise. But Calhoun didn't know that Harden had already read their plan before they even arrived. A few days earlier, Harden had noticed 2 men pretending to hunt near his property. They moved too quietly, too purposefully, in a pattern that told Harden they weren't hunting at all. They were scouting. He had counted their bootprints, studied the likely paths they would take, and mapped out where they would position themselves during an attack. He had prepared the cabin accordingly, turning it into a defensive structure that would give him every advantage. The attack began when the first man reached the edge of the clearing. His name was James Murdoch, a farmer and veteran whose son had died in the war. He moved slowly, holding his rifle in one hand and an unlit torch in the other. But Harden's first shot struck before Murdoch could even lift his arm. The bullet hit him in the thigh, not a fatal wound, but one designed to cause maximum panic. Murdoch screamed in pain, and the sound cut through the night, breaking the silence that Calhoun had hoped to maintain. The men froze, unsure where the shot came from. Harden fired 2 more warning shots, hitting the ground near their feet, spraying dirt and gravel into their faces. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and carried through the clearing like a command. "Next one is through bone." Confusion rippled through the attackers. Calhoun tried to regain control and shouted for torches to be lit. In seconds, 14 torches burst into flame, lighting up the clearing and turning the darkness into a chaotic mix of shadows and blinding brightness. Men began running toward the cabin from 4 directions, shouting and trying to coordinate. But Harden had been ready for this too. He fired again, hitting Vernon Tyree in the shoulder and knocking him to the ground. His next shot shattered the torch in Seal Tyree's hand, covering him in burning pitch. Another shot struck a water barrel Harden had placed strategically outside. The explosion of water drenched several riders and extinguished 2 torches. Every move Harden made was calculated. He didn't shoot randomly. He shot exactly where he knew it would cause the most confusion and fear. Calhoun shouted orders, but panic was spreading faster than discipline. The attackers couldn't understand how Harden was hitting targets so precisely in the dark. They didn't know he had memorized the positions where torchlight would create silhouettes. They didn't know he had spent hours studying the land, learning which angles gave him the clearest lines of sight. They didn't know he was mentally counting their movements just as he had counted Confederate soldiers through his rifle scope years ago. Harden's voice carried again. "You're down 3 men and you haven't even reached the walls. I've got 37 rounds left and all night to use them." The claim was a lie. He actually had more, but it didn't matter. The numbers sounded real, and in the heat of fear, the attackers believed him. He even called out Calhoun's hiding spot behind the large oak tree, demonstrating that he could track them even when they thought they were invisible. More riders began backing away. The assault faltered. Murdoch's cries added to the chaos, making men question whether rushing forward was worth the risk. Calhoun hesitated. He knew staying meant more casualties. Retreating meant embarrassment. Eventually, he chose retreat. One torch after another disappeared into the trees. Within minutes, the clearing was empty again, except for the distant glow of torches gathered near the tree line. Unlike previous nights, though, Harden knew they weren't gone. They were regrouping. He had won the first round, but the fight was far from over. Inside the cabin, Harden reloaded his weapons. His hands were steady, but he felt the weight of reality. He had delayed them, not stopped them. They had come too far, planned too carefully, and brought too many men to give up now. He knew they would attempt something even more dangerous next. And he needed a strategy that didn't depend only on bullets. He needed something that targeted their fear, and soon he would give them exactly that. The attackers did not ride home after their failed assault. Harden watched from inside his dark cabin as their torches gathered near the tree line, flickering like angry fireflies. He knew exactly what was happening. They were arguing. Some men wanted to leave and return in daylight. Others, especially those driven by pride and shame, wanted blood immediately. Harden also understood something deeper. These men couldn't afford to fail again. Twice now they had come to intimidate him, and twice they had been forced to retreat. Their honor, twisted as it was, would not allow a third retreat. Inside his cabin, Harden prepared for the next move. He rechecked his firing slits, his pistols, his shotgun, and the ammunition he had sorted so carefully. He still had enough bullets to fight for hours, but he also knew this simple truth. No matter how skilled he was, 27 determined men would eventually overwhelm him. He wasn't facing an enemy in open terrain. He was one man inside a small wooden structure. If they didn't rush him, they would burn him out. If they didn't burn him, they would wait until dawn. Harden's skill bought him time, but not a guarantee of survival. Meanwhile, at the tree line, tempers flared among the attackers. Calhoun tried to regain control. Some riders demanded to rush the cabin again, saying Harden couldn't shoot them all. Others protested, remembering the precision of his shots. One man asked, "And who volunteers to be the distraction?" No one responded. Even hatred has limits when death feels too close. Harden realized that continuing the fight the same way would lead to one outcome. He would die, and the truth of what happened would die with him. He needed a new strategy, one that would strike at their fear of consequences, not just their fear of bullets. So, he did something shocking. He walked outside. The torches froze in place. The riders tensed, rifles ready, confused by the unexpected sight. Harden stood on his porch, not aiming, not hiding, just standing with his rifle pointed to the ground. Then he spoke clearly across the clearing, "Calhoun, you and I need to talk." For a moment there was silence. Then Calhoun answered cautiously, "Talk about what?" Harden replied, "About what happens when I die. Because that's what this is about, isn't it? You're not leaving until one of us is dead." The men shifted nervously. This wasn't the frightened pleading they expected. Instead, Harden laid out the truth with steady confidence. He told them about the letters he had written, 7 detailed accounts naming every man involved in the attacks. Letters addressed to Union officers, federal marshals, politicians, and newspapers. He explained that if he died, his wife would find the metal box and mail the letters, exposing the conspiracy. Federal investigators would arrive, men would be arrested, some would go to prison, their families would be disgraced. Calhoun tried to act unimpressed, saying Harden was bluffing, but there was doubt in his voice. Harden knew it. He pressed harder. He explained exactly where the letters were buried and that Ruth Ann had full instructions. He warned them that killing him would not silence him. His words were already on their way to powerful hands. Harden understood these men. They feared federal authority more than anything. They wanted to act like warriors, but they were terrified of real legal consequences. He used that fear as a weapon stronger than bullets. After several minutes of intense whispering among the riders, Calhoun finally stepped forward. He offered Harden a deal. He had 1 week to leave Tennessee forever. Take his wife, pack his things, and disappear. If he stayed, they would return with 100 men and burn him out without warning. Harden expected this offer. It was a face-saving move for Calhoun, a way to claim victory without risking more casualties. But Harden rejected it immediately. Calmly he said, "No, this is my land, I'm not leaving." The riders were stunned. Calhoun called him a fool. Harden replied simply, "Maybe. But I'm a fool who knows exactly how many of you I can kill before I fall." Then he ended the negotiation with a cold truth. "You have 1 minute to ride out before I start shooting again." That line broke their resolve. One by one, the torches began to move backward, saddles creaked. Hooves retreated. Harden watched as the night swallowed them, but he also knew something else. This kind of hatred never admits defeat. And he was right. 4 nights later, they came again. This time they brought no torches, no shouting, no dramatic entrance. Harden woke to the smell of thick smoke, burning his throat and eyes. The attackers had surrounded the cabin silently and built small smoldering fires of wet leaves to fill the cabin with choking smoke without giving Harden targets to shoot. It was a military strategy designed by a mind that had learned from its failures. If Harden stayed inside, he would suffocate. If he came out coughing, half, blind and gasping, they would shoot him the moment he stepped into the open. The trap was perfect, but Harden was not done fighting. What he did next would determine whether he lived through the night, or died inside the cabin he had built with his own hands. When Harden woke to the smell of smoke on the 4th night, he knew instantly that the attack had changed. This wasn't the wild, torch-waving intimidation from the past. This was careful, calculated, and deadly. The smoke filling his cabin was thick and heavy, burning his lungs and stinging his eyes. It wasn't from dry fire, wood either. This was smoke made from wet leaves and green branches. the kind that creates choking fumes without producing flames bright enough to reveal the attacker's positions. It was the work of someone who understood military tactics, someone who had studied how to trap a man without risking direct gunfire. Harden dropped to the floor, where the air was slightly clearer, and tried to breathe. He had maybe 2 or 3 minutes before the smoke would overwhelm him. Outside, he heard low voices, the soft shuffle of boots, and the metallic clicks of rifles being prepared. They were close, no more than 30 yards away, and they were forming a killing circle around the cabin. Every exit was already covered. Coming out through the door would be suicide, but Harden refused to panic. If the war had taught him anything, it was that fear kills faster than bullets. He crawled to the fireplace, coughing hard now, and used his hands to dig into the ash-covered dirt beneath. Years earlier, when he built the cabin, he had dug the chimney base deep into the ground to make it sturdy. That deeper foundation now allowed him to claw out a small hollow where he could breathe air pulled downward by the chimney's own draft. The air was thin, but it was enough to stop him from passing out. He forced himself to think clearly. The smoke was coming from the north, meaning the attackers had built their smoke pits there. That meant at least 4 men were occupied feeding the fires. The remaining attackers, 20-something men, were positioned in a ring around the cabin, rifles ready, waiting for him to stumble out choking and blind. Harden mapped their likely positions in his mind, using the patterns he'd learned from years of combat. He knew one thing for certain: if he came out the front door, he was dead. So he went to his escape route. When Harden built the cabin, he had intentionally left one section of logs slightly looser than the others. Not enough to look suspicious, but enough that, in the right moment, he could kick them outward to create a narrow opening. He had carved that weakness into the wall years earlier, understanding that any defensive position needed an escape path. Now he needed it more than ever. The smoke was becoming unbearable, filling every part of the cabin. Harden couldn't see his own hands anymore. He crawled to the weak section of wall and braced himself with his back against the opposite side. His lungs were screaming for air. He pushed. The logs shifted slightly. He pushed again. A loud crack echoed through the cabin. Outside, someone asked, "What was that?" Another replied, "Probably the cabin settling." They were still waiting for him to come through the front. Harden gave one final push, using every bit of strength he had left. The logs shifted outward enough for him to squeeze through. Smoke poured out through the new gap, making visibility worse for the attackers. Harden grabbed a pistol. His Sharps rifle was too long to maneuver, and slipped through the broken wall into the tall grass. The air outside hit him like cold water. He gasped, coughing violently, but he kept his body low and began crawling down toward the creek. The attackers noticed movement at the front of the cabin and fired into the doorway. Bullets slammed into the wood, sending splinters flying. They were convinced he was trying to escape through the door. Harden let the confusion work for him. He slid into the creek, letting the cold water swallow him almost completely. Only his eyes and nose remained above the surface. The gentle current carried him downstream, hidden beneath the overhanging brush. From this distance, he could hear the attackers shouting, scrambling, and lighting torches as they searched for him. After drifting about 200 yards, Harden pulled himself out onto the bank, shivering and drenched. His lungs burned, his eyes watered, but he was alive. He hid behind a fallen sycamore, watching as his cabin burned. It was surreal, the home he had built with his own hands, the school where Ruth Ann had taught children to read, everything he had protected for years, now engulfed in flames, surrounded by men who believed they had finally destroyed him. But Harden wasn't done. He saw the attackers spreading out, searching the woods in small groups. Their formation was broken, their discipline shaky now that they believed they had won. This was Harden's chance, not to kill them, but to make them understand that victory would never belong to them completely. He moved through the woods until he reached a small rise overlooking the clearing. From there he could see Calhoun standing confidently in front of the burning cabin, directing the search. Most of the riders had removed their hoods. They thought Harden was dead or as good as dead. Harden raised his pistol, steadied it, and fired. The bullet hit Calhoun's hat, knocking it clean off his head. Chaos exploded instantly. Men dropped to the ground in terror as Harden's voice boomed across the hollow, rough and smoke. Damaged but full of fury, that was a warning. The next shot won't miss. Silence fell. Even the crackling flames seemed to quiet. Then Harden gave them a final message, his voice echoing across the burning clearing. You didn't drive me out because you were stronger. You drove me out because you outnumbered me. That isn't courage, that's arithmetic. And with that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving fear behind like a shadow that would follow those men for the rest of their lives. Harden spent the rest of that night moving through the Tennessee woods like a hunted animal, silent, cautious, and driven by pure survival. He knew the attackers were scattered across the hollow searching for him, jumping at every snapped twig and every rustle of leaves. Harden had struck them with a fear deeper than bullets. They believed they had killed him when the cabin burned, and now realizing he was alive shook them to their core. A man who refuses to die becomes more terrifying than one who fights openly. Harden traveled south through dense brush, using old hunting trails that only he knew. He avoided open areas, crawled beneath fallen trees, and walked inside shallow streams to hide his tracks. The smoke in his lungs made breathing painful, but he pushed forward. He understood that staying too close meant giving the attackers a chance to reorganize. They were angry, embarrassed, and now frightened. Exactly the mix of emotions that drives men to do something reckless. As Harden continued through the forest, he replayed everything that had happened. His home, the cabin he built, the fields he planted, the classroom Ruth Ann created, was gone, burned to the ground, a lifetime of work destroyed in one hateful night. At moments the grief felt heavy enough to stop him in his tracks. But every time he felt his spirit weakening, he remembered Ruth Ann's students, their innocence, their courage, and what those attackers had done to them. That memory hardened his resolve again. He traveled for several hours until he reached the ridge line overlooking the valley. The sky was turning faintly gray, the first sign of dawn. From this height, Harden could see a thin column of smoke rising from the place where his cabin had stood. The sight cut into him, but he didn't let the emotion control him. Instead, he focused on the truth. The cabin was gone, but he was not. And so long as he lived, the attacker's victory would never be complete. At daybreak, Harden reached a small abandoned hunter's shack deep in the woods. It wasn't much, just a roof, a broken door, and a dirt floor. But it gave him shelter. He collapsed inside, exhausted and shivering from the creek water that had soaked him hours earlier. For the first time since the attack began, he allowed himself to rest. His sleep was shallow, filled with flashes of fire, smoke, and gunshots. But even in that restless sleep, his mind stayed alert like a seasoned soldier. By midday, Harden woke and knew what he had to do next. He needed to reach Ruth Ann. She was staying with a family across the ridge, a place far enough from the hollow to avoid danger, but close enough to make Harden fear the attackers might seek revenge by targeting anyone connected to him. He began his journey immediately, traveling carefully, using the thickest parts of the forest as cover. Meanwhile, back near the burned cabin, the attackers were falling apart. Some men insisted Harden had fled the state. Others argued that he was still hiding in the woods, watching them. Calhoun was furious and humiliated. Losing his hat to Harden's shot had cut deeper than he admitted. For hours, the men searched the woods, firing blindly into bushes, shouting Harden's name like a challenge. But Harden was long gone. Eventually, Calhoun abandoned the search and ordered everyone to leave the hollow. The men rode away, looking over their shoulders at every sound. None of them felt victorious. None of them felt brave. Harden's final message, "That's not courage, that's arithmetic," echoed in their minds like a curse. By early afternoon, Harden finally reached the farmhouse where Ruth Ann was staying. When she saw him, smoke-stained, bruised, exhausted, she ran to him and held him with trembling arms. He had no words at first. Everything he had seen, everything he had lost, weighed too heavily. Ruth Ann didn't need an explanation. She already knew the cabin was gone. She had seen the smoke rising in the distance. Quietly, she led him inside and cleaned the burns on his hands and the cuts on his arms. Later, as they sat together, Harden revealed the most important truth. They could no longer stay in Tennessee. The attackers would return. Their rage wasn't finished. Harden had humiliated them, wounded them, and exposed their cowardice. Men like that do not simply accept defeat. They obsess over revenge. Harden explained that leaving wasn't surrender. It was strategy. He had done everything possible to resist them. He had defended his land, protected his wife, and fought with honor. But staying meant certain death, not only for him, but for Ruth Ann and anyone who supported them. Ruth Ann listened quietly, her hand resting in his. She agreed. They had lost their home, but not their future. They could rebuild elsewhere, somewhere the law mattered, somewhere education wasn't a threat, somewhere their children could grow without fear of night riders. Before leaving the valley for good, Harden went back one last time to the creek where he had buried the metal box. He dug it up, opened it, and removed the 7 letters he had written. One by one, he tore them apart and tossed the pieces into the water. The letters had served their purpose. They had protected him. But sending them now would put dozens of families in danger and spark months of bloody retaliation across the county. Harden wouldn't risk that. He chose peace over vengeance. With the metal box empty, he buried it again beneath the roots of an old oak tree. Then he walked away without looking back. Harden and Ruth Ann left Tennessee 2 days later, traveling west toward Missouri. They carried what little they had left, some clothes, a few tools, and a love strengthened by fire and survival. The hollow behind them lay quiet now, but its history would linger like smoke for generations. And though Harden never returned, the men who chased him never forgot him. They remembered the night he walked out of fire and spoke like a man impossible to kill. Harden and Ruth Ann traveled west in silence for the first several days, their wagon rolling slowly along rough dirt roads that wound through forests, hills, and small settlements. Every sound, every snapping branch, every distant hoof beat made Harden tense. Years of danger had trained his instincts to react quickly, but now, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't preparing for a fight. He was preparing for a new life. The farther they traveled from Tennessee, the more the weight on their shoulders slowly lifted. But the memories of the hollow, the flames, and the hatred they endured lingered in their minds like shadows that refused to fade. When they finally reached Missouri, they stopped at a small farming community near the town of Sedalia. It wasn't a perfect place, but it was quiet, and the people looked at them with curiosity rather than hostility. Harden rented a small cabin near a creek while he looked for work. Ruth Ann immediately asked the local minister if she could help teach children, and he welcomed her warmly. It was the first sign that they might actually build something good here, something untouched by violence and fear. Over the next few months, Harden worked as a skilled carpenter and farmhand, earning enough money to buy a small patch of land. It wasn't as large as his Tennessee homestead, but it was fertile and peaceful. He rebuilt his life board by board, putting up a new cabin, digging a new well, planting new crops. Every swing of the hammer, every turn of the soil felt like reclaiming a part of himself that the night riders had tried to destroy. Ruth Ann taught at the local schoolhouse and became known for her gentle but firm way of guiding children. People respected them, not because of their past, but because of their character. Yet even as Harden settled into this new life, the memories of Tennessee remained a part of him. There were nights when he woke suddenly, drenched in sweat, hearing the echo of gunfire or the crackling of flames. Ruth Ann would hold him until his breathing slowed. Other times she would wake from dreams of the burning schoolroom, and Harden would comfort her in the same way. Some wounds heal on the surface, but the deeper ones take longer. They accepted this truth, supporting each other through every moment. As the years passed, Harden's reputation changed. In Missouri, he wasn't known as the man who fought off an entire group of night riders. Instead, he became known as the man who built houses that lasted for generations, the man who helped neighbors rebuild barns lost to storms, the man who showed up at every harvest to lend a hand. He kept no weapons displayed in his home, though he still owned his Sharps rifle and kept it safely stored away. He hoped to never use it again. Ruth Ann's influence grew as well. She taught dozens of children to read and write, and many parents thanked her for opening doors their families had never imagined before. Her classroom became a haven of learning and kindness. Some even said she brought light into a community that had once been divided by old grudges and bitterness. In time, the couple had 2 daughters. They raised them with love, honesty, and stories about resilience, though Harden rarely spoke about Tennessee. He didn't hide the past, but he didn't let it define their future either. He taught his daughters the importance of standing up for what is right, but also the wisdom of knowing when to walk away. The girls grew up strong, educated, and proud. Ruth Ann made sure they could read before they could even tie their shoes, and Harden made sure they could survive in the outdoors as well as any frontier child. Years later, when Harden was an old man, someone asked him why he left Tennessee so suddenly, why he abandoned land that he had worked so hard to build. Harden paused a long moment before answering. His eyes, once sharp and alert like a soldier's, were softer now, carrying decades of experience. "I didn't leave because I was beaten," he finally said. "I left because I chose life over ashes. A man can rebuild a home, but not if he becomes a ghost haunting the ruins." That simple truth defined the rest of his years. In the end, Harden lived a long life, quiet, steady, and meaningful. He died peacefully on a warm summer morning, surrounded by his wife, his daughters, and grandchildren who adored him. They buried him under a large oak tree near the creek, a place he loved for its calmness. On his gravestone, Ruth Ann chose a single line that captured who he truly was. He stood his ground, then walked toward the light. Back in Tennessee, the hollow slowly healed. Trees grew where the cabin once stood. Grass covered the scars of the fire. The men who had attacked him grew old as well, carrying the weight of their actions in silence. Some died with guilt in their hearts. Others pretended they had forgotten. But none of them ever spoke proudly about that night. Harden's voice, the one that echoed across the clearing even as flames rose, stayed with them. It reminded them of what cowardice looks like when it tries to disguise itself as courage. And in Missouri, far from the darkness of the hollow, Harden's family thrived. His daughters grew into strong women. Ruth Ann lived many more years, teaching children and telling them stories about bravery, fairness, and the strength of choosing peace when the world demands violence. Harden's life became a quiet legacy, not of war, not of revenge, but of endurance. And though the hollow in Tennessee never saw him again, it never forgot the man who refused to bow, refused to break, and refused to let hate decide the ending of his story. This is where Nathaniel Harden's journey ends, not in fire, but in peace, and in the future he built with his own hands.